Hello, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Fried Brain Science. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Fry. I've spent the last 30 years professionally working with all things toxic and venomous. And on this channel, we will dive into the weird, the wonderful, and the horrifying. Please subscribe and like. We are just starting out and need your support. This episode is about what to do with your body after you die. We will cover 10 options. Unlike taxes, death is inevitable. We don't like to talk about it or think about it, which means we don't plan for it very well. Here we will talk about the death of a physical body, which is a natural process. This episode is not an anthropological examination. We will not explore the metaphysical aspects of life or death or any conception of the beyond. We're also not covering every aspect of every burial practice. That would simply take too long, and we would all die before we finish. Now, with all the standard disclaimers out of the way, let's get started. Death 101. What happens to a body? Well, first, the muscles become soft and flaccid. They lack tone, and this is evident to the touch. Rigor mortis is the stiffening of the muscles that shows up 2 to 6 hours later. The warmer the ambient temperature, the quicker it can happen, and it can last up to 36 hours. Facial muscles are quite obvious, particularly the opening of the jaw. The body goes through 6 discrete stages, which are used in criminal forensics to help pinpoint the time of death. Decomposition starts immediately, but refrigeration slows this process down. Typically, a body is not a health hazard, except for special situations such as disease outbreaks, such as Ebola, where in traditional African funerals, the deceased is touched by loved ones who unfortunately can get infected and die, perpetuating the vicious viral cycle. Another case where bodies can become problematic is mass casualty events. In countries that can afford the infrastructure, mobile morgues can be set up in shipping containers, as was the case in New York City during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. In other regions of the world, the only options are mass graves or the burning of bodies. Now, we'll go through 10 normal burial practices where a body doesn't represent a danger, and we have options and time to consider various dispositions. Number 1, mummification. This is an ancient method of preserving the body by drying it out. This typically involved the removal of soft tissue, organs, and brains, which are stored in separate containers. The hollow body was then dried out. While we think of this as being something the Egyptians did, it was actually practiced globally. In fact, the oldest deliberately interred mummies are 7,000-year-old ones from Chile, about 2,000 years earlier than the Egyptians. It was also practiced by Christianity, with the belief that the bodies would be resurrected one day. Egyptians, however, took the practice of mummification to its most intricate and elaborate level. Unlike the Chilean society, mummification in ancient Egypt was typically reserved for the elite of society, such as the royalty, noble families, government officials, and the wealthy. And this was because the practice was very expensive due to the elaborate nature of it. While mummification is not a viable option in Western societies today, this method still captures our imagination. Number 2, sky burials. This is a fascinating funeral practice in the Tibet region. A human corpse is placed on a mountaintop to be consumed by vultures. While this option is environmentally sustainable, today the practice is in severe decline and threat because the vulture population themselves are under threat from an anesthetic used in cattle that is extraordinarily toxic to them, and they come in contact with this medication while fulfilling their biological role of nature's cleaners and consuming of carrion, including dead cattle. Number 3 is internment. This is your conventional burial. Historically, a body would be interred within about 3 days of death, to avoid the smell and bloating of decomposition. In many societies, this is still the case. But where our lifestyle requires an extension to this sort of time frame, for example, to allow a family to travel across a country, then either refrigeration, lowering of the temperature, or a chemical form of body preservation must be used. And this practice of embalming uses extraordinarily toxic chemicals, such as formalin, which is a cancer-causing chemical and can also affect fertility. As such, they're very dangerous to the workers that administer them. And if you think about it, where the workers have to go through such elaborate protective equipment, face shields, goggles, respiratory masks, chemical-resistant aprons, neoprene gloves, overalls, and rubber boots, well, then obviously burying a body full of these chemicals can lead to contamination of the groundwater. And indeed, this is the biggest environmental concern associated with the practice of conventional burial. To put it in perspective, in the US alone, each year, over 3 million liters, which is about 827,000 US gallons, of toxic embalming fluid makes its way into the groundwater from human bodies each year. And on top of this, the coffins themselves are made of heavily chemically treated wood, adding more chemicals into the groundwater as pollution from the burial practice. And then there's also the amount of wood that it takes. For the US alone, to service the number of coffins used each year, about 5 million acres of forest is cut down just to serve that. Data for other countries would also be considerable. Further, and to prevent the coffin from sinking down into the ground, that there's actually concrete vaults often lining that part of the cemetery, adding even more use of resource, and of course concrete itself leaches out huge amounts of carbon dioxide in its production. So that's a lot of chemical pollution to deal with this very natural process. And then on top of that, the cemeteries themselves require significant maintenance and water use to maintain that desired green lawn look, which in an arid environment like somewhere like Arizona would be a huge use of very scarce local water. And then there's the challenge of where to put the bodies. The biggest challenge for conventional burials is the availability of space. If we want each body to have an exclusive eternal spot on the ground, then obviously we will at some point run out of space. Indeed, most cemeteries have a time limit for exclusive use, usually about 20 years. After this period, the person is taken out and put into another spot in a remote area, or sort of stacked on each other, and then another person gets that exclusive use single spot. It may be sad for us to acknowledge, but data shows that most graves stop being visited after only 2 generations. So just like with real estate, where space is at a premium, burial spots are very expensive. In cities like New York, London, Paris, or Sydney, Australia, such luxury is only available to the very wealthy. Most of the population of the world now live in cities, and people want to be buried nearby where they've lived so their families and friends can come visit. Some cities, like Hong Kong, for example, are addressing the problem with ever shorter grave reuse time, which is now at 6 years. Other places like Israel are approving the creation of multi-story underground burial tunnels. So, as you can see, what we have to see as a traditional burial in the Western culture is actually a highly problematic practice that we at least have to discuss and think of some practical solutions. Number 4, natural burial. This is a chemical-free alternative to embalming and heavily treated coffins. And natural burials are a return to an older, simpler way that's making quite a comeback. This type of burial doesn't involve embalming or concrete vaults that line the graves. Instead, the bodies are wrapped in a shroud or placed in a biodegradable casket so that they can decompose naturally. It's an appealing idea that allows a body to rejoin the cycle of life by going back into the earth. In some cases, people are buried under a sapling tree, which becomes a memorial marker. However, getting a natural burial can actually be very complex. Few cemeteries currently allow it, but the movement is growing. Number 5 is burial at sea. Burial at sea ceremonies can be rather beautiful, but they are legally complicated and quite expensive. For example, in Australia, burial at sea requires a permit, and these are usually only granted if the deceased had strong ties to the sea, such as being a retired naval officer. And if approved, the coffin can only be pushed into the water deeper than 2,000 meters, and it must not interfere with shipping or fishing. Number 6 is a different form of aquatic burial. This is the Neptune Memorial Reef off of the US city, Miami, which consists of underwater artificial reefs that are actually memorials, so the people are interred in these reefs, creating a dive site at the same time a unique way of interring a body. It's a pretty cool way, and certainly one that is gaining in favor. Now it's time for a macabre anecdote. While a corpse properly buried at sea is unlikely to reappear, the sea may not be a great way to secretly dispose of a body created during a crime. And this is illustrated in the most spectacular way in Australia, of course. In this particular case, a freshly caught tiger shark was brought into the Sydney Aquarium, put on display, because it was a nice large specimen, and promptly vomited up the arm of a missing underworld crime boss, who thought to have been, one way or the other, and this was confirmed by very distinctive tattoos on his arm that identified that part of it belonging to him. Quite the exhibit. Shows daily, twice on Saturday. Number 7, cremation. Cremation used to be controversial in Western culture, but it is now widely accepted. While Christianity, Islam, and Judaism favor earthen burial, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism all favor cremation. Unsurprisingly, the highest rates of cremation are observed in the cities, where the problems with availability and cost of burial land are at their most acute. Cremation undoubtedly relieves the pressure of securing new land for burials, but it does bring a new suite of issues all of its own. Particularly the fact that this method is highly energy consumptive, and through it is a massive contribution to global warming through higher emissions. To put it in perspective, the average human body takes up to 1.5 hours to cremate at a temperature of around 1,000 degrees Celsius, about 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's a huge energy cost to cremation. Collectively, Hinduism and Buddhism represent over 1.6 billion people. In India and Nepal alone, the Hindu open-air body burning ceremonies consume up to 60 million trees annually and produce about 25% of the region's brown carbon emissions, and as such remains the region's second largest contributor to global warming. Cremation relies on a large amount of energy for the combustion process and releases noxious gases and carbon emissions into the atmosphere. Pollutants include carbon monoxide, fine soot, sulfur dioxide, heavy metals, and dental fillings contribute massively to mercury emissions. For a long time, cremation was seen as a viable alternative to earthen burials, but we now understand we may simply be trading one problem for another. Number 8, Promession is a way to freeze dry your body, where it's first immersed in liquid nitrogen until it's crystalline and brittle, and then shattered by short ultrasonic vibrations, reducing the body to a powder. The end result is much like that of cremation, but it requires a fraction of the energy, and the liquid nitrogen used in the process is non-polluting. Number 9. Next up is alkaline hydrolysis, also known as dissolution or resomation. This is perhaps the most promising development in body disposition. Known as water cremation, it's a cleaner green cremation technique using alkaline hydrolysis and requires 1/10 of the energy of traditional cremation. The process uses potassium hydroxide solution at a high pressure to heat the body but not boil it, and it ultimately reduces the body to a liquid that is safe to dispose and a small amount of ash. Alkaline hydrolysis is already widely used in vet practices to dispose of deceased animals. Nonetheless, like Promession, it has a long way to go before it becomes mainstream for humans, including overcoming the fear of novelty and gaining regulatory approvals. Number 10. Last but not least is donating your body to medicine or science. This may be donating for organ transplants, through to donating your body for medical schools to use to train the next generation of doctors, or donating it for scientific study, including the use for forensic training, such as the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation's famous body farm, to train the next generation of crime scene investigators. In this video, we covered 10 methods of body disposition. This list is not exhaustive. It was meant simply as a conversation starter. Understandably, the topic of death is unsettling and complex, but we can no longer put it into an emotional, too-hard basket. We must at least pause and think if our current practices are indeed the best way to honor the life of a loved one. The key, as usual and rather anticlimactically, lies in communication. We need to get better at pulling our heads out of the proverbial sand, admitting mortality, nobody gets out of life alive, and discussing its practical aspects and considerations. It's unfair to expect a grieving person who has just lost a loved one to be thinking clearly and prioritize abstract ethical concepts. It's up to us as individuals to consider our options now and tell our friends and family our wishes and put it in writing as part of our will. Most of our modern practices simply rely on inertia. People embalm, bury, or cremate because this is how our family has always done it. But mortuary practices are more flexible and diverse than we can imagine. They have frequently changed before and can change again. The problem surrounding many modern mortuary practices will remain whether or not people are informed about them. Once you know about your consequences, you can no longer ignore them, right? Well, we hope so. So, thank you very much for watching this first of many episodes. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week when we cover the top 10 venomous animals.